"You do not belong here, and you definitely are not fooling anyone tonight," Charles Whitmore said loudly enough for the polished marble lobby of the private club to fall into an immediate, uncomfortable silence, the kind of silence that does not come from peace, but from collective attention turning toward a single moment. And Marcus Ellington did not respond right away. He did not raise his voice or step back. He simply stood there beneath the warm chandelier light, his posture straight, his tailored charcoal suit fitting him with quiet precision, his gaze steady and unshaken as if the accusation had not landed the way it was intended. And around him, members of the club paused mid-conversation, glasses held halfway to their lips, eyes shifting between curiosity and quiet judgment, because in a place like this, presence alone was a statement, and Marcus did not match what many of them expected to see. And Charles took a small step forward, his confidence reinforced by the attention, his voice sharpening slightly. "We have a list, and your name is not on it. So let us not waste anyone's time pretending otherwise," he added, his tone controlled but edged with certainty, as if the conclusion had already been decided before Marcus even walked through the door, and a few nearby guests exchanged subtle glances, the kind that carry unspoken agreement, the kind that reveal how quickly perception becomes reality in rooms like this. But Marcus remained still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression calm in a way that did not invite challenge yet did not retreat from it either. And for a brief second, his eyes moved past Charles, scanning the interior of the club, the dark wood paneling, the framed legacy photos along the walls, the discreet plaques that listed founding members, his gaze resting just long enough on each detail to suggest familiarity rather than curiosity. And that small, almost invisible shift went unnoticed by most, but not by everyone, because one of the younger staff members standing near the reception desk hesitated, his fingers hovering over the tablet, as if unsure whether to continue or to look again. And Charles noticed the hesitation, his jaw tightening slightly as he turned just enough to reassert control over the situation. "There is nothing to check," he said, more to the room than to Marcus, reinforcing the narrative he had already created. And Marcus finally looked back at him, not with defiance, not with irritation, but with a calm focus that felt out of place in a moment designed to provoke reaction. And when he spoke, his voice was even, measured, carrying just enough weight to cut through the silence without raising it. "Then you should probably check again," he said, and the simplicity of the sentence did not challenge Charles directly, but it shifted something in the air, something subtle yet undeniable, because it introduced doubt into a space that thrived on certainty. And for a fraction of a second, Charles did not respond, not because he was unsure, but because the tone of Marcus's voice did not match the role he had assigned him. And that mismatch lingered just long enough to be felt by the room, just long enough for the moment to stretch beyond its original shape. And then Charles exhaled softly, a controlled breath that reset his posture, his confidence returning as he gestured toward the reception desk. "Run it again if you must," he said, dismissively, as if the outcome was already known, and the staff member nodded quickly, tapping through the system with renewed urgency, while Marcus stood exactly where he was, not moving forward, not stepping back, simply present, as if the outcome did not need to be forced, as if time itself would reveal what words could not. And in that stillness, beneath the polished surface of the club, something had already begun to shift, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that would soon make the room question everything it thought it understood. The staff member at the reception desk tapped through the system again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if the extra attention might somehow force the result to match what was expected, and the glow from the screen reflected faintly against his face, revealing a hesitation that had not been there before. And Charles Whitmore noticed it immediately, his posture tightening just slightly as he stepped closer, not enough to seem concerned, but enough to reassert presence. And the room remained quiet, the earlier conversations now fully dissolved into observation, every guest aware that the moment had extended beyond a simple misunderstanding. And Marcus Ellington stood exactly where he had been, his expression unchanged, his gaze steady, not on the staff member, not even on Charles, but somewhere in between, as if the outcome unfolding was already accounted for in his mind. And the staff member cleared his throat softly, his voice low, careful, "It is still not showing under standard access," he said, and Charles gave a short nod, the confirmation aligning with his expectation, his confidence settling back into place as he turned slightly toward the surrounding guests, as if ready to close the situation. But the staff member did not move away, his fingers hovering above the screen, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he leaned closer. And that pause, that small moment of hesitation, stretched just enough to disrupt the flow again. And Charles glanced back, irritation flickering across his expression. "If there is something unclear, resolve it," he said, his tone controlled but firmer now. Because uncertainty in a room like this was not acceptable, and the staff member nodded quickly, shifting his attention to a deeper layer of the system, accessing a different panel, one that required additional authorization, and for a moment, nothing changed, the same polished interface, the same structured layout. But then a subtle delay appeared, a brief loading indicator that had not been there before, and Marcus's gaze moved slightly, not reacting, but acknowledging, as if recognizing the shift before it fully revealed itself. And across the room, one of the older members lowered his glass, his attention sharpening, sensing that something was no longer aligning with the expected outcome. And Charles exhaled softly, his patience thinning, his confidence still intact, but now accompanied by a growing need to conclude the moment. And just as he began to speak again, the staff member's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed, his posture straightening as he looked back at the screen, reading something that had not been visible before, and he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before speaking. "There is an alternate listing," he said quietly, and the words landed differently, not as correction, but as complication. And Charles turned fully now, his focus returning to the screen, his earlier dismissal replaced by a sharper attention. "What does that mean?" he asked, his tone still controlled, but no longer dismissive, and the staff member swallowed lightly, his eyes scanning the information again, as if confirming it before saying more. "It is not under guest access. It is under ownership tier," he said. And the phrase itself carried a weight that shifted the atmosphere immediately, subtle but undeniable, because ownership did not appear casually in a system like this. And Charles's expression tightened, not in disbelief, but in recalculation, as he stepped closer to see for himself. And Marcus remained still, his presence unchanged, his silence now carrying a different kind of gravity. Because the moment was no longer about whether he belonged. It was about understanding why the system was beginning to say that he did. The phrase ownership tier did not fade from the air after it was spoken. It lingered, stretching across the polished marble floor and settling into the silence that followed. And Charles Whitmore did not respond immediately, not because he had nothing to say, but because the meaning of those two words required more than a quick dismissal, and he leaned slightly toward the screen, his eyes scanning the interface with sharper focus. His confidence still present, but now edged with something more deliberate, something closer to caution, and the staff member stepped aside just enough to give him space. His earlier certainty replaced by a quiet attentiveness as he watched the director process what was now visible. And across the room, a few guests shifted their posture, not dramatically, but enough to signal that the moment had moved beyond curiosity and into something more significant. And Marcus Ellington remained exactly where he stood, his expression unchanged, his gaze steady, not fixed on the screen but aware of it, as if the information appearing there was not new to him, only newly revealed to everyone else. And Charles exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that steadied his posture as he straightened, his voice returning with measured authority. "There must be an error in how it is categorized," he said, and the statement was calm, precise, delivered with the confidence of someone used to correcting systems that did not align with expectation. But the staff member did not immediately agree, his eyes flickering back to the display as he navigated deeper, accessing additional layers that were not part of routine verification, and the screen shifted again, subtle changes unfolding across the interface, lines of data reorganizing, permissions recalibrating, and for a moment, the room held its breath, not visibly, not collectively, but in a way that could be felt in the stillness of movement, in the absence of sound, in the way every detail seemed to sharpen under the weight of what was about to be confirmed. And Charles leaned in once more, his attention narrowing, his earlier dismissal now replaced by a focused need to understand, and the staff member spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost careful. "It is not an error," he said, and those words carried a different kind of finality, because they did not correct, they confirmed, and Charles's expression shifted just slightly. Not enough for the room to fully register, but enough to mark the beginning of a recalibration, and he glanced briefly toward Marcus, just for a fraction of a second, as if reassessing something he had already decided, and that glance, brief as it was, did not go unnoticed by those closest to the interaction, because it introduced a new possibility into the moment, one that had not existed just minutes ago. And Marcus did not react to it. He did not acknowledge the shift, he simply remained present, his silence now carrying a weight that extended beyond composure, beyond control, into something that felt deliberate, something that suggested timing rather than reaction, and the staff member continued, his fingers moving across the screen with increasing precision as more details surfaced, each confirmation reinforcing the same conclusion. And Charles straightened again, his posture firm, his voice returning with a measured edge. "Then explain it," he said, and this time, the request was not dismissive, it was directive, grounded in the need for clarity rather than control, and the staff member hesitated, just briefly, before responding. "The system shows controlling interest access linked to this profile," he said, and the phrase landed with quiet impact. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise, because it introduced a level of authority that could not be easily dismissed, and the room absorbed it in silence, the earlier assumptions beginning to loosen, not completely, but enough to make space for something else, something that had not yet been fully revealed but was now impossible to ignore, and in that space, between what had been assumed and what was beginning to be understood, the balance of the moment shifted again, subtle but undeniable, and Marcus stood at the center of it, unchanged, as if the outcome had never been in question, only the timing of its recognition. The phrase controlling interest access did not create noise. It created pressure, the kind that settles slowly into a room until every person inside it feels the shift without fully understanding it. And Charles Whitmore stood still for a moment longer than usual, his posture straight, but no longer effortless, his mind moving through layers of authority, ownership structures, internal protocols, searching for a path that would restore the certainty he had carried just minutes earlier, and the staff member remained at the console, his hands steady now, his hesitation replaced by a quiet focus as additional confirmations appeared on the screen, each one aligning with the last, each one reinforcing a reality that was becoming harder to dismiss, and across the room, the guests had stopped pretending not to watch, their attention fully anchored to the unfolding moment. Conversations abandoned, expressions measured, curiosity sharpening into awareness, and Marcus Ellington remained unchanged at the center of it all, his stance relaxed yet grounded, his gaze calm, not demanding recognition but no longer existing outside of it. And Charles turned slightly toward him again, this time not with dismissal, but with a careful assessment, as if reevaluating every detail he had overlooked, every assumption he had made too quickly. And the silence between them carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because it revealed a shift not in volume, but in position, and Charles spoke again, his tone controlled but quieter now. "If this is some kind of administrative overlap, it will be resolved immediately," he said, and the phrasing was precise, chosen carefully to maintain structure, to keep the moment within the boundaries of procedure, but the staff member did not confirm it. Instead, he navigated further into the system, accessing records that required higher clearance, and the interface responded with a sequence of confirmations, layered approvals that did not contradict each other, and as those confirmations settled into place, the room seemed to tighten around them, not physically, but perceptually, as if the space itself was adjusting to a new center of gravity. And Charles stepped closer to the screen, his eyes scanning rapidly now, his confidence no longer leading his movements, but following them, trying to catch up with what was already unfolding. And the staff member spoke again, his voice steady, no longer uncertain. "It is not overlap," he said. And he turned the screen slightly, enough for Charles to see clearly, enough for the truth to become unavoidable. And Charles's expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from across the room, but in a subtle tightening around the eyes, a brief pause in his breathing that marked the moment of recognition. And for the first time since the interaction began, he did not respond immediately, because the information in front of him did not require interpretation. It required acceptance. And that acceptance did not come easily, not in a room where his authority had always been unquestioned. And Marcus remained still, his presence now carrying a different kind of clarity, not as a guest, not as a question, but as something already embedded within the structure Charles had believed he controlled. And the staff member added one final detail, his voice low but precise. "The authorization is active at the highest level," he said, and those words settled into the moment with quiet finality, because they did not suggest possibility. They confirmed position, and as Charles straightened slowly, his posture resetting, his expression composed once again, the difference was no longer in what he showed, but in what he now understood, that the situation had moved beyond correction, beyond dismissal, into something far more definitive, something that had already shifted the balance before anyone in the room realized it. And in that realization, the dynamic between them changed completely, not through confrontation, but through recognition, and the room felt it, even before a single word acknowledged it. The words highest level authorization did not fade after they were spoken. They settled into the room like a quiet verdict, and for a brief moment, no one moved. Not the guests, not the staff, not even Charles Whitmore, who stood with a composed posture that now carried a subtle weight of recalibration, as if the structure he had relied on had shifted beneath him without warning, and Marcus Ellington remained exactly where he was, his presence unchanged, his silence now carrying clarity rather than ambiguity, because the system had already begun to speak on his behalf. And across the polished interior of the club, the atmosphere adjusted in small, almost imperceptible ways. Conversations did not resume, glasses remained untouched, attention remained fixed, and the staff member at the console continued to navigate through the interface, confirming what had already been revealed, each additional layer reinforcing the same reality. And Charles finally exhaled, a controlled breath that marked the transition from assumption to understanding. And when he spoke again, his tone was measured, lower than before, no longer directed at the room, but focused on the situation itself. "Step aside for a moment," he said to the staff member. And the request was not forceful, but it carried a different kind of authority, one that sought clarity rather than control, and the staff member complied immediately, moving just enough to allow Charles full view of the system. And as Charles leaned in, his eyes scanned the information with precision, tracing the authorization path, the ownership structure, the embedded permissions that could not be overridden by standard protocol. And for the first time since the interaction began, his movement slowed, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because what he was seeing did not require interpretation, it required acceptance, and behind him, the guests remained silent, their attention sharpened, their earlier assumptions beginning to dissolve into something more cautious, more observant, and Marcus shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not asserting presence, but adjusting his stance just enough to signal readiness, as if the moment had reached a point where movement would soon follow recognition. And Charles straightened slowly, his posture still composed, but no longer carrying the same certainty it had before. And when he turned back toward Marcus, his gaze was different, not softened, not apologetic, but focused, deliberate, as if reassessing the entire situation through a new lens. And for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the silence between them now filled with understanding rather than assumption. And then Charles glanced once more toward the console, confirming internally what the system had already made clear, before returning his attention to Marcus. And when he spoke, his voice was controlled, precise, carrying a measured respect that had not been present before. "If there has been a change in controlling interest, we will need to verify it through corporate channels," he said, and the statement was structured, procedural, but it no longer dismissed the possibility, it acknowledged it, and the shift in language did not go unnoticed by the room, because it marked the first visible adjustment in authority, and Marcus inclined his head slightly. A minimal gesture that neither confirmed nor denied, but allowed the process to continue on its own timeline. And as the moment settled, the staff member's screen updated once more, a quiet notification appearing that did not require input, only recognition, and the staff member's eyes widened just slightly as he read it. Before looking up toward Charles, the message already understood before it was spoken. And in that instant, the room felt the next shift approaching, not through sound, not through movement, but through the quiet certainty that what had begun as a question had now become something else entirely, something that would not be resolved by procedure, but by reality itself. The notification did not make a sound. It did not flash or demand attention. It simply appeared on the screen with a quiet certainty that made it impossible to ignore, and the staff member froze for a fraction of a second as his eyes locked onto the message, reading it once, then again, as if confirming that what he was seeing was not a misinterpretation but a direct update. And Charles Whitmore noticed the shift immediately, the subtle change in posture, the stillness that replaced motion. And without asking, he stepped closer again, his presence now guided by awareness rather than control, and the staff member turned the screen slightly, not dramatically, just enough for Charles to see clearly. And the message remained there, unchanged, concise, undeniable, confirming what the system had been building toward since the first inconsistency appeared. And Charles read it in silence, his expression composed, but his eyes revealing the exact moment recognition became certainty. And for a brief second, he did not move, not because he resisted it, but because the weight of the information required a different kind of response, one that could not be rushed. And across the room, the guests sensed the shift even without seeing the screen, the tension tightening into something more defined, more final, and Marcus Ellington remained where he stood, his posture steady, his gaze calm, his presence no longer positioned outside the structure of the room, but fully embedded within it, as if the system itself had aligned around him. And Charles straightened slowly, his shoulders settling into a new position, one that carried less assumption and more precision. And when he turned toward Marcus, the distance between them felt different, not measured in steps, but in understanding. And for the first time since the interaction began, he did not speak immediately. He allowed the moment to settle, allowed the room to recognize what had already changed before he gave it voice. And when he finally did, his tone was controlled, even, but no longer dismissive. It appears there has been a confirmed update to the ownership structure, he said, and the phrasing was deliberate, careful, acknowledging the reality without dramatizing it. And the words moved through the room quietly, not as a shock, but as a realization, because the tension that had been building now had a direction, a definition, and the guests absorbed it in silence, their earlier assumptions dissolving into a new awareness that reshaped their perception of the moment. And Marcus inclined his head slightly, a minimal acknowledgement that neither claimed nor denied, but accepted the statement as part of a process already in motion. And the staff member continued to monitor the system, his movements now steady, confident, because there was nothing left to question, only to follow. And additional confirmations began to appear, each one reinforcing the same conclusion, each one aligning the internal structure of the club with the reality now visible on the surface. And Charles took a slow breath, his posture composed, his expression neutral, but the shift in his presence was unmistakable, because the authority he had once carried without question was now being recalibrated in real time. And as he stepped slightly to the side, creating a subtle opening in the space between himself and Marcus, the gesture did not announce itself, but it was felt, because it marked the first physical adjustment to the new balance that had already taken hold. And in that quiet movement, the room understood what the system had already confirmed, that the moment was no longer about access, or verification, or procedure. It was about position, and that position had already changed. The subtle space that Charles Whitmore created between himself and Marcus Ellington did not go unnoticed. It was small, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention. But in a room built on hierarchy and control, even the slightest shift in positioning carried meaning, and the guests felt it immediately, not as a dramatic change, but as a quiet realignment, the kind that moves through perception before it is ever acknowledged out loud. And Marcus stepped forward for the first time, not with urgency, not with force, but with calm intention, his movement measured, deliberate, as if he had been waiting not for permission, but for alignment. And as he crossed the threshold that had moments earlier been denied to him, no one stopped him, No one spoke, the absence of resistance more powerful than any verbal confirmation. And Charles turned slightly to follow his movement, not blocking, not leading, but observing, his role shifting in real time from gatekeeper to participant, and the staff at the reception desk adjusted their posture instinctively, their attention now directed toward Marcus with a different kind of awareness, one that replaced uncertainty with recognition, and Marcus continued walking into the main lounge area of the club, the soft lighting reflecting off polished surfaces, the quiet elegance of the space now framing him not as an outsider, but as someone entirely at ease within it. And as he moved, the guests subtly parted, not dramatically, not in a rehearsed way, but in the natural rhythm of people adjusting to a presence they could no longer ignore, and Charles followed a few steps behind, maintaining composure. His expression controlled, but the distance between them now defined by something other than authority. And as Marcus reached the center of the room, he paused, not to address the crowd, not to make a statement, but simply to stand, his presence anchoring the space in a way that required no explanation, and the silence that followed was different from before, no longer driven by tension or curiosity, but by anticipation, because everyone in the room understood that something had already shifted, even if it had not yet been fully spoken. And Charles came to a stop a few feet away, his posture upright, his gaze steady, and for a moment, the two men stood within the same frame of attention, no longer in opposition, but in transition, and Marcus glanced briefly around the room, taking in the details, the architecture, the people, the atmosphere, his expression calm, thoughtful, as if evaluating not the situation, but the space itself. And then he turned his attention back to Charles, his voice measured, even, carrying just enough presence to reach the room without rising above it. "I believe there are a few things that need to be clarified," he said, and the statement was simple, but it carried weight, not as a challenge, but as a continuation of a process that had already begun, and Charles nodded slightly. A controlled acknowledgement, his earlier certainty now replaced by a careful precision in how he responded. And as the moment held, the balance of the room continued to adjust, not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily, as if aligning itself with a reality that had already been confirmed. And in that alignment, Marcus no longer stood as a question within the space. He stood as its defining point, and everyone present felt it, even before the next words would make it undeniable. The room did not return to normal after Marcus Ellington spoke. It did not resume its earlier rhythm or dissolve back into casual conversation. Instead, it held its position, suspended in a quiet awareness that something more was about to be defined. And Charles Whitmore stood facing him, with a composed stillness that now carried intent rather than control, his earlier authority reshaped into something more measured, more precise. And for a brief moment, neither of them moved, the silence between them no longer uncertain but deliberate, as if both understood that the next words would not escalate the moment, but finalize it. And Marcus took a small step forward, not to close distance, but to align himself fully within the center of the space. His posture relaxed yet grounded, his presence steady in a way that required no reinforcement. And as he looked directly at Charles, his expression remained calm, focused, carrying a quiet certainty that did not seek validation. And when he spoke, his voice was even, controlled, carrying clearly across the room without rising above it. "You should take a moment and review the latest update from your corporate office," he said. And the sentence was simple, almost understated, but it carried a weight that settled immediately into the atmosphere, because it did not argue, it directed. And Charles did not respond right away, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, as if the suggestion aligned with what he already suspected, and he turned slightly toward the staff member, who was already scanning the system again, his eyes moving quickly as a new notification appeared, more detailed than the last, containing information that did not require interpretation, only acknowledgement. And the staff member inhaled quietly before speaking, his voice steady but lower. "There has been a finalized transfer," he said, and the words landed with clarity, not as speculation, not as possibility, but as fact. And Charles's gaze returned to Marcus, his expression controlled, but the shift was undeniable now, because the structure that had defined his authority was no longer intact in the way he had assumed. And Marcus held his gaze without intensity, without challenge, simply present, allowing the reality to settle on its own. And across the room, the guests absorbed the moment in silence, their earlier curiosity replaced by a quiet understanding that the balance had fully shifted, and Charles straightened slightly, his posture composed. His voice measured as he spoke again. "We will need to confirm all operational implications," he said, and the phrasing remained formal, procedural, but it no longer resisted the outcome. It acknowledged it, and Marcus inclined his head just slightly, a minimal gesture that neither agreed nor disagreed, but allowed the process to continue without interruption, and the staff member continued reading, his eyes scanning the final lines of the update before adding, "It includes immediate authority over all club operations," he said, and the sentence carried a finality that settled over the room completely, because it did not leave space for interpretation, and for a moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been made clear, and Marcus stood at the center of that clarity. His presence now fully aligned with the structure of the space, not as an exception, not as an anomaly, but as its defining point, and Charles remained still, his composure intact, but his position undeniably altered, and in that stillness, the room understood what had already been decided, even before the final step would make it visible to everyone. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt resolved, as if every layer of uncertainty that had once filled the room had now been replaced by a clear and undeniable understanding. And Marcus Ellington stood at the center of that clarity without shifting his posture, without adjusting his tone, his presence unchanged from the moment he first walked through the door, yet now carrying a weight that no one in the room could ignore. And Charles Whitmore remained facing him, composed as ever, but no longer positioned as the authority that defined the space, instead standing within it as someone who had just witnessed its structure change in real time. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to challenge, only the acknowledgement of what had already taken place. And Marcus finally moved, not toward the exit, not toward the crowd, but slightly to the side, his gaze sweeping across the room once more, taking in the faces, the details, the atmosphere that had so quickly shifted around him. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, even, carrying the same measured control it had held from the beginning. "Effective immediately, all operations will be reviewed," he said. And the sentence did not raise tension, it defined direction, and the words settled into the space with quiet authority, not demanding attention, but commanding it nonetheless. And the staff members responded almost instinctively, their posture adjusting, their focus sharpening, as if the system that had confirmed his position was now reflected in their actions. And Charles inclined his head slightly, a controlled acknowledgement. His expression neutral but precise, and when he spoke, his tone matched the new balance of the room. "Understood," he said, and the simplicity of the response carried more weight than any longer explanation could have, because it signaled acceptance without resistance. And across the room, the guests began to shift, not in conversation, but in perception, their earlier assumptions now replaced by a quiet recognition of what they had just witnessed. And Marcus took a step forward, then another, moving through the space with the same calm intention he had always carried, but now without obstruction, without question, the path ahead of him naturally opening, not because it was demanded, but because it was understood. And as he approached the exit, he did not look back, he did not pause, he simply continued, his presence leaving the room as steadily as it had entered, and behind him, the atmosphere did not return to what it had been, it remained altered, defined by the moment that had just taken place. And Charles stood where he was for a second longer before turning toward the staff, his posture resetting, his role shifting to meet the new structure. And as quiet instructions began to move through the room, not loudly, not urgently, but with clear intent, the reality became fully visible to everyone present, that what had begun as a dismissal had ended as a complete redefinition, not through force, not through argument, but through presence, precision, and timing. And in that realization, the club itself felt different, not because its walls had changed, but because the power within them had. And Marcus Ellington had never needed to raise his voice for that to happen.